Chapter 48 to 49. Harry reflexively paused to get himself together and not freak out. The first recorded sighting of this woman was more than 10,000 years ago, and according to the Ancient One, Selene had been a contender for the position of Sorcerer Supreme a number of times. Not that this meant she was a good person. The position of Sorcerer Supreme was given to someone who was strong enough to protect the world from mythical threats. Morales were not a requirement, and many a Sorcerer Supreme in the past were not people one would want to meet. Harry knew he wasn't going to like what was to come, but he still had to act as if he didn't know it. The text message he received at least made sense now. Harry didn't hold out his hand for a shake, instead he gave a respectful half-bow and said, "I'm certain most of what you've heard about me won't do me any justice. So what is it you wish to speak of?" The immortal gave a beautiful smirk and said, "I'd like for you to sell your company to me." The telepathic command she gave to simply do as she said had all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Harry snapped his fingers and conjured a chair behind him and behind her and sat down. "No, I don't think I will, Miss Gallio." Selene could not detect any mental protections within Harry's outstandingly organized mind, and yet her psionic abilities had no effect. That, and the fact that he seemed to have just cast magic in front of her and she couldn't feel its presence, made her eyebrows twitch in surprise. Harry wondered when was the last time this woman was surprised, and felt he should be a bit proud of himself. Selene turned to confirm the seat behind her was not an illusion and sat down before turning back to say, "It appears my sources are woefully underinformed." Harry smiled back and said, "Yes, I doubt they've informed you I'm a student of an acquaintance of yours. Though calling her the Ancient One when she is a mere trifle over 9 centuries old is a bit much, don't you think?" Selene's gaze quickly changed. There was no twitch or narrowing or eyes or movement, but she no longer looked at Harry like a predator would look at meat. She saw another predator. Continuing with the initiative, Harry continued, "My company cannot be sold, so I'm going to politely request that we stay out of each other's way. You will gain nothing from going against me." Selene lightly asked back, "Can your company truly not be acquired if I were to kill you? I doubt all of your employees would be so stubborn." Harry paused and considered this. Not her threat. Using telepathy on a goblin was not a great idea, and goblins had dozens of ways around magic-based mind control. Both of which were irrelevant points, as no one would ever assume Harry's employees were goblins in the first place. No sane or powerful person would allow themselves bound by the contracts required to work with goblins. Harry always laughed at that and wondered if he was an exception or just insane. Of course it didn't matter to him. Sanity was highly overrated. No, Selene's point was that Harry's company not being in her control or not being destroyed outright was not an option for her. That meant she had something to lose if Harry's company continued as it was. Harry unpaused and said, "I see. So you're the one who built Multivac." Selene's smile was all the confirmation Harry needed that the machine that could predict the future and the location of mutants was designed by her. That meant that Sebastian Shaw was Selene's minion, and the fact that Harry was affecting the future was affecting her as well. Of course, they seemed to be assuming it was Harry's company that was making the future harder to see, and not Harry himself. Selene also inferred a few things from Harry's accusation and answered back, "So Shaw's toys are still alive, I see." Harry gave a curt nod. Information had to come from somewhere after all, so there was no point in denying it. Harry said, "I can promise you that my death will grant you nothing. If I have unintentionally gotten in the way of any plans you have, then either adapt or ask for my assistance. As I said, you will gain nothing from going against me. You are making many assumptions. If killing you gives me nothing, then what about killing your friends? Your family? And I don't believe you have earned the right to speak to me as if you were an equal. If you know of me, then you should know your place." Harry sighed and raised a hand. He had already been chanting mentally for the last few moments, and at the chant's completion, a blood-red flame emerged in Harry's hand. Harry said, "Now you are the one making assumptions. You think I care about them? What do you think will happen if I release this Hellfire Heart? I'm sure you can guess." Harry used his strongest occlumency and mental prowess to lock away his feelings for others and emitted only a cold indifference and apathy. Can't use hostages if the other person doesn't care about them. The Hellfire Heart was a spell Harry came up with after going through Belasco's Book of Spells. It used the principle of Fiendfire, which was strengthened by Harry's knowledge of the Darkhold, and principles of Hellfire Harry learned from the Grand Grimoire, which were strengthened by what he learned from Belasco's Book of Spells. Since the magic contained far more sources than just his own, Selene could easily feel it. And what she felt was uncontrollable. Once the heart was released, it would burn everything until it went out. At the moment they were at MIT, and everyone there wanted to listen to Harry's dissertation. She knew that Harry had brought friends and professors with him. They would all die if Harry released that spell. Celine gave Harry a cold look and said, "You're bluffing." Harry smiled and dropped the flame. Celine was absolutely certain Harry was bluffing, so she was stunned to see him release the spell and could only watch it fall to the ground. Harry teleported out of the room and the fire exploded into a torrent of black flame. Celine was fast, but she couldn't teleport, so she could only shield herself and watch as her barrier was smashed back through wall after wall as the tide of flames devoured everything. In the blink of an eye the entire building was devoured and she was thrown through the final wall outside. Blood red and black flames danced against each other as the entire grounds of MIT was reduced to cinders. Of course this was not the end. The black flames started flowing into themselves and formed a massive flame demon. The spell created the heart, and the heart created the flame. Once the flame was created, it would join the heart and the true purpose of the spell was shown, the birth of a massive hellfire fiend. Celine knew she had to get away, she gained nothing from fighting such a thing after all and didn't care that it would destroy the city. She could stop it, but that would require more resources than she would gain from doing so. However, the moment she looked away from the hellfire fiend, she realized she had been duped. In the sky above the city was another city looked down. In the distance was another city that was aligned vertically from up to down. The room they were in had been taken into the mirror dimension without her being aware of it, and she was now trapped with the fiend. Celine glared at the massive beast of flames and lifted a hand in its direction and closed it. The beast felt what she was doing and looked over to her with its blood-red flaming eyes and roared, however the flame around it was vanishing, being put out. The towering construct charged at her but was losing height and strength with each moment. Before it could reach her it was shorter than she was. Celine bent down and blew at it, snuffing out the last of the flame. In the same moment, a glowing red longsword pierced through her chest from behind, destroying her heart. Celine instinctively threw out a psychokinetic wave to toss her now visible assailant back, and in the next instant her wound healed. Harry steadied himself and said, "I heard you were good with fire, but seeing it in person is really something else." Celine realized then that Harry had only pretended to leave her in the mirror dimension. She assumed that he was under the impression she would not be able to leave without a sling ring, as even the Ancient One could not do so. She could, of course, and she had already sworn revenge against Harry for his trick, but it turned out he was simply waiting. Celine answered back, "You've seen nothing yet. Fighting me in this dimension was a great mistake." Black sigils appeared in the air all around her and darkness coalesced into them, taking the form of demons. In the next instant over 30 high-strength demons wielding weapons and armor forged of shadow had appeared. She pointed at Harry and said, "Capture him." Harry didn't move. Summoning was actually much easier in the mirror dimension, but there was no way to move a summoned creature from the mirror dimension back into the normal world without cost, so that was not a loophole. Once the demons were within range, Harry conjured a golden glyph, which shot red chains into the chest of each demon. Most tried to block, but the chains were ethereal and passed through their weapons, shields, and armors. Harry released the glyph and the chains vanished, but the demons didn't move. Harry smiled and said, "Attack Celine with everything you got." Celine was more than a little surprised when her summoned demons she spent her own life force to call had been taken out of her control and were attacking her instead. How could she know Harry had memorized the Grand Grimoire, which contained both the Greater Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, books which had more information on controlling demons than any other? As long as it was a demon Harry knew about, he would know a way or two to control it. He didn't know about them all, of course, and he couldn't control a demon in their own realm, but Celine's summons were ones Harry was familiar with, so there was only one way for that to turn out. Celine cast multiple spells at the attacking armored demons, and while she was distracted, Harry used his dimensional energy to shift the space of the mirror dimension. Buildings folded out from the ground and changed the landscape as direction and gravity lost meaning. Celine's footing easily adjusted as she was also manipulating the mirror dimension to crush or separate the demons. She only needed to touch them to dissipate them, so they were not threats to her if they did not attack all at once. In the next moment, the building Celine was fighting on folds over at Harry's command and smashed against Celine. A breath later, the entire building cracked and shattered into rubble, floating in the directionless space with Celine floating in the center. An invisible Harry slashed against her once more with his sword, and she flew back to distance herself and conjured her own sword. Harry matched her flying speed and slashed through her flesh over and over. At this point, Celine realized she is slower than normal. Harry's strength is much higher than what she could wield, but she could see that his speed did not reach her own, yet she was failing to dodge or parry his slashes and was taking more and more damage. She cast a wave of magic through herself and returned to her max speed, deflecting Harry's sword and throwing him back. She realized that the sword to her heart he initially struck her with had cast a slow spell against her, and the spell had been refreshing with every slice of Harry's energy sword. Harry felt the impedimenta jinx he'd cast on her get dispelled and knew she figured out his trick. Harry's magic was undetectable, so fighting while casting jinxes and invisibility spells was obvious. Harry's standard spells seemed to have no effect on her, but when cast through his sword the spells worked as it was the equivalent of casting a spell through a wound instead of against the skin. Harry was going for the long fight. Celine's body had much in common with his own in that she was basically a bundle of flesh and magic held together by a massive life force. Much like a video game boss, she would not die until her accumulated life force, her health points, had reached 0. Harry had spells that could drain life force of course, but draining life force was Celine's mutant power and the spells he tried had no effect on her as they were weaker than what the immortal could do naturally. Harry turned invisible again and moved to strike once more. Not wanting to be left on the defensive, Celine used her psychokinesis to freeze all the debris in the area around her in place. She could feel if any of it was touched so she could find Harry through that. Harry teleported some distance away when he felt what she was doing and took what looked like a gourd out of his inventory. Harry pointed it at Celine and used his own psychokinesis to pull the trigger within. Celine's head and upper torso exploded in a mass of blood and gore. A line of buildings behind her shattered outwards, damaging the line of buildings to each side of them. The gourd contained a pocket dimension which contained a very long railgun. Harry eventually crafted at Jean's nagging to make one. The bullet traveled roughly 20 times the speed of sound and were actually magically shrunken. The bullets unshrank to the size of a cannonball before it reached its target, and the kinetic force could probably put a dent in the moon. This of course meant he couldn't use it on Earth. The mass of flesh reformed itself back into Celine with her clothes perfectly intact just as Harry reappeared behind her and slashed her once more. The bullet only did physical damage, which was actually less than the magic damage Harry's sword strikes were dealing to her, so after striking her again Harry teleported away and fired another round with his railgun. However, instead of Celine turning into paste again, the path of the cannonball-sized bullet bent hard to the side the moment it was close to her. Harry sensed the spell she had just used and realized she had bent the space. Projectiles that moved using physical momentum would be turned away from her. Harry made note of that spell and reappeared in front of her and started slashing again. He couldn't give her time to breath or escape. Both were capable of flight, so the twisting buildings and mountains of rubble around them didn't get in the way. Celine took the next slash without blocking and sent a lightning bolt spell at Harry which smashed him into a nearby building. Harry endured it and countered her next cast of lightning with a lightning rod spell he cast at the ground that caused lightning to be directed to that point. Celine tried holding him in place with psychokinesis, and Harry countered by making a film of psychokinesis around himself which allowed him to slip out of any psionic grip she placed him in. Celine shouted, "Enough!" 12 enormous purple glyphs appeared in the space around them and Harry felt the space lock up, preventing him from magical teleportation. Celine conjured dozens of shards of black ice and pointed them at Harry before launching them forward. Harry threw a silver ring in front of him, and when it expanded, Celine saw her own back on the other side of the ring. She looked behind her to see a second ring had formed, and Harry used his own psychokinesis to speed up the shards of black ice to prevent her from blocking. Harry's portals had so many different types of magic in them, he had yet to find a way to block them, and even standard space locks could not do so. Celine dodged a few, but some of the black ice hit her and Celine's body instantly froze. Harry flew over to the ice sculpture and tried to place it in his inventory, but unsurprisingly, it didn't work. Harry could in fact put petrified non-magical animals in his inventory and hoped he could do so with a frozen person as well. The black ice exploded as Celine's flesh and blood changed into shadow. The shadow expanded and engulfed Harry before reforming into Celine. She had grabbed Harry's arm and smiled. Then frowned. Her life force absorption ability was unable to drain anything from Harry. Harry knew the gig was up. She had only humored him with this fight because she knew once she touched him, she would win. Celine was a psionic vampire and she could drain the life and will from her victims, turning them into her slaves. No matter how strong Harry was, once she had him in her grasp, she would control him. Or so she thought. Harry released the strength energy of Sidorak, his immortal dragon chi, and created his heavy eldritch sword. His single slash shattered Celine's psionic barrier and cut her in two, dealing many forms of damage. Harry didn't stop at one cut and sliced over and over. Celine's dismembered body parts shifted back into shadow, and Harry cast a non-verbal Patronus charm and a bus-sized dragon of light appeared within the shadow. The dragon exhaled its fire-shaped light breath and from what Harry could tell, dealt serious damage to Selene. Serious damage being relative. If Selene had a health bar at 10,000, then Harry's total damage up to this point would be less than 1,000. Of course, Selene's magic and psionics also required her life force to use. Putting out the Hellfire Fiend used over 1,000 points, and the skills she used up to now also used up about 500. Of course, this meant that Harry had only forced her down a quarter of her total might, but his own magic was nearly empty. The Hellfire Heart alone used up more than 2/3 of his magic. Not that Selene could sense his reserves. Selene's shadow form turned back into flesh. Harry almost flinched at her look. She was beyond livid at this point. Selene spoke calmly, but her voice traveled through every inch of the mirror world. I went easy on you because I wanted you alive. As you don't understand how to appreciate my kindness. It is time for you to die. Harry calmly answered back, there is still much about me you do not understand. Just remember that I did warn you. You will gain nothing from going against me. Her eyes narrowed at that. She could tell Harry was referring to something, but she could not grasp what. In any case, it was time to end this. Harry could feel a significant portion of Selene's life force was suddenly being used. In the next moment, wave after wave of psionic force spread out from Selene. Every building and structure was shattered and the space around Harry became nearly solid. Since she couldn't hold Harry, she held the space around him using her psychokinesis. The buildings getting wrecked around them was not done intentionally, but was merely a byproduct of the intense power she was using. Suddenly, another wave was expanding outward from another direction. Harry sighed and used load save. Harry's body turned to dust just as the wave reached the pair and all concepts lost meaning. Solids turned to liquids and multicolored matter formed from nothing and the outlines of structures blurred and bent. Selene's control over space was cut and caused a massive backlash as her psionic senses, which should have been able to passively scan everything around her, started ripping her own mind to shreds as if the knowledge of the space around her was an attack against her own mind. Matter, space, and color blurred together and broke apart as the immortal's body crumbled and elongated. Every moment of existence dealt heavy damage to her, and anything she tried to defend herself with ended up dealing more damage to her. The bubble that engulfed her and caused this had engulfed the entire Mirror City, which caused the view to look like something from a Salvador Dali painting. From the outside the bubble had lasted only a few seconds before popping, but within where time and space had lost meaning, so it could not be calculated if Selene experienced moments, seconds or minutes within. What could be seen however was that when the bubble popped, everything within turned to dust as reality re-established itself. Selene herself was nowhere to be seen. Harry's particles were able to shift from his existing position back to his save point even during the collapse of causality, as nothing about Harry's load save feature worked using logic or physics. Harry emerged inside a closet in his room back at the Institute. One benefit load save had over actually dying was that he did not drop a full level. If he was 80% of the way through level 100 and died, he would return to 80% of the way through level 99. Load save, however, actually would take him to 99% of level 99. Just barely under the energy requirement threshold to restore his level. Thankfully he had leveled up 2 days ago, so there was barely a waste in dropping to 99% of the previous level. Harry paused and went over his stats and the fight in his head. Harry Potter. Level 231, age 15. STR 300, AGI 310. Int 510 was 475. Luck 30. Warrior Path rank 29. Scholar Path rank 46. Magic Path rank 42. Tech Path rank 36. Business Path rank 30. Crafting Path rank 29. Dragon Path rank 12. Psionic Path rank 23. Rogue and Wanda would not stop nagging him to increase his luck, and since he was inventing more often, he eventually relented and brought it up to 30. The rest of his skills and stats were more rounded out since Harry was a multi-class character with stackable abilities. That's why his Eldritch Sword did measurable damage to Selene when a normal sword would do almost nothing and normal magic would likely not pierce through her magic defenses. Selene herself, if Harry had to give an estimate, would have been around level 400 with a magic path rank of 35 and a psionic path rank of 45. Unless Jean went full Phoenix Avatar, which had irreversible consequences, then Selene could be considered one of the strongest psionics on the planet, just behind Charles when he was boosted by Cerebro. Even if Harry used everything in his inventory, he had no way to kill her before she could run, which was why the only thing he brought out from his inventory was the railgun gourd. Harry could use powerful equipment to fight beings at higher levels, like when he killed Chiantang, but the Black Dragon fought him without flying and actually died when his heart exploded. For high-level immortals who could survive their hearts exploding, Harry could only fight them until they ran away and came back for revenge one day. The demon Nastir was a good example. Harry wanted to deal as much damage as possible before she could run, which was why he didn't use Phoenix Flame. Harry didn't know if Selene survived the reality bomb or not, but it didn't matter. Records show that Selene was successfully killed around the 6th century and came back some time later. Even if her store life force hit 0, she could still somehow come back. She wasn't called immortal for nothing after all. No, the point of the fight was not to kill Selene or make her flee, but to make her understand that she had nothing to gain from fighting Harry. If Harry wanted to make her flee without a fight, he would have summoned Phoenix Flames instead of a Hellfire Heart. Harry felt such a thing could permanently kill the immortal if used against her while she was in a weakened state. This time, if she survived, she would find out that Harry had survived as well, thus making her think Harry could resurrect or was immortal like her. Immortals tended to stay out of each other's way, so revealing this was the only thing Harry could do. Harry doubted she would recover the same strength anytime soon, so if she did show again, Harry felt with some prep and magic armor, he could finish her off. Since he didn't show her his Phoenix Flames this fight, she wouldn't know he could end her until it was too late. As for the reality bomb itself, it was something he needed to go back and plant. The text message he received, Bill and Ted BJ Cage, RB5 Malawi and Quachas, was the shorthand of a plan. In the movie Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which he abbreviated to Bill and Ted BJ, they used a cage against the villain, which they set up by coming back from the future after defeating him with the cage. RB5 Malawi and Quachas meant he needed to use the Reality Bomb Mark V, his strongest weapon capable of wiping cities from the map. Harry wouldn't consider the fight a win or loss. He had to use a reality bomb after all, and she was better built for a long fight than he was. Of course, Selene was far worse off. Harry could recover spent magic and levels, and the resources he lost in the reality bomb's use could be regained. Selene's health points were not recoverable with rest. She had to drain life force from others to regain her might, and that was not an easy thing for her to do without attracting attention. Selene was a mighty enemy, but her weakness was that she could in fact be defeated by numbers if she spent more life force attacking others than she got from draining her attackers. Harry unpaused and got out a time turner and went back 3 hours. He then opened a portal to MIT and another to the mirror dimension and found a place to set the reality bomb out of harm's way. He didn't need to arm it with a timer. This thing was dangerously unstable and would go off pretty easily, so Harry had to set up all kinds of protections around it. The immense psionic wave Selene emitted at the end to finish him would be enough to break through the protections and set the bomb off. Next, Harry found the room Selene intended to meet him in and created a portal to the mirror dimension in the doorway and spent some time hiding it. He concealed himself and waited there while maintaining the portal whose silver ring was hidden in the wall, roof, and ceiling of the doorframe. Selene eventually showed and Harry held his breath and presence with every wizard magic he could think of. Selene wasn't expecting an ambush of course, so she entered the room through the door after hypnotizing one of MIT's staff to bring Harry to her. The concealed Harry from the future then sent the text message to the current Harry, who shortly afterwards was led into the room where the door was shut. Harry cancelled the portal once the door was closed and walked over to the hypnotized staff member. Harry wasn't the type who invaded every person's mind to tell if they were controlled or not, so he hadn't seen that this woman had no idea what was going on. Harry used telepathy to release her from the weak hypnosis Selene had over her and asked, "Excuse me, I seem to have gotten lost. Can you direct me to where the stage is for the dissertation?" The woman shook her head for a moment and asked, "Mr. Potter?" "Of course, right this way." Harry met a few more of his fellow nerds and geniuses who wanted a few words with Harry he was happy to share. When it was time, someone went on stage to quiet the audience and get them ready. Once called over, Harry walked up on stage. He was tempted to imagine everyone in their underwear, but far too many members of the audience were older men. In fact, with the exception of his girls and some of the students from the Institute and from MIT, most of the audience were older men with many a bald spot scattered throughout the seats. A cinematic projector lit up the wall behind him showing the slides he had prepared to introduce the basics of metaphysics. Although on paper Harry was 15, 6 weeks shy of his 16th birthday, Harry's 6-foot stature, well-defined muscles and healthy frame could easily pass for someone in their late teens in casual clothes and early 20s when he wore professional attire. His confident gaze prevented any member of the audience from thinking he did not deserve to stand there. Electricity, as we think of it, is a property of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, imagine there is a planet out there that through some quirk, does not have a single ferrous metal on that planet. No iron, no copper, silver, or gold. Nothing that could conduct electricity or could turn into a magnet. Imagine if some form of life existed on that planet. Now imagine explaining electricity and magnetism to that species. Could you do it in a way they would understand? Not really. You would need to reference ferrous, electrically conductive metals. Such materials are how we interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. Harry had several slides which showed magnets, copper wires, and semiconductors to illustrate the point. Harry continued, metaphysics is the study of other spectrums of energy previously unknown because we did not have any materials that could interact with them. Such materials do not form naturally on this planet, and it was only within the last year that a means to synthesize materials that could interact with these spectrums was discovered by me. Several hands rose, of course, to no doubt ask what these processes were and where Harry discovered them. Harry certainly was not going to tell people he met a Time Lord and spent centuries studying his sonic screwdriver to figure out how to use sound to alter the material physics of nearly anything. Hold your questions until after the lecture, please. There are questions I am going to answer and questions I am not going to answer, so asking either at the moment would be a waste of time. At the end of the lecture, I am going to hand out 10 packages which include several samples of these materials, which I'll be calling metagems, and instructions on how to use them to interact with the fields I am going to go over. Harry would of course tell everyone that he expected the care packages to be returned, and he expected many of them to be stolen or lost. Each metagem had a spell which combined the portkey spell and the switching spell to make a long-distance switch. After the designated time, the metagems would be swapped with identical gems which had not been processed with the sonic screwdriver. There was also a spell that would destroy the gems if they were damaged, so if someone tried to scrap any off, the gem would break and its properties would be lost. Not that scrapping any off would let someone make more. It was possible if you knew how to use a tiny bit of a gemstone and use it to grow more. Using such a process on Harry's metagems would either not work or cause them to turn back into normal gems. Harry's dissertation was about 2 hours long, and the only reason it was so short was because much of it referenced material he included in his textbooks, and the dissertation was just a sample to prove that he wasn't talking out of his ass. Once it was over, Harry told everyone how they could get one of the 10 sample packages. Any group with research purposes may apply to receive one of the packages. The group, however, must have a history of at least 10 years and sign a form stating that all samples must be returned in the same condition they were given in 2 months, no later than June 17th. They must also agree to the penalties of losing any sample in the care package. Those who cannot agree to such penalties should not bother to apply for any of the samples. You must also sign an agreement that any and all findings from studying the samples must be openly published. The sample package included 7 metagems and showed how to use them and what they could do. For example, a material physics altered quartz could be used to interact with the astral plane. Altered quartz was actually how Harry's cell phones worked. They transmitted info through the astral plane, which was why they could bypass physical barriers and distance. Harry used some tricks he learned from Lockheed about astral tech to make the signal undetectable in the astral plane without specific tools. If he didn't, then astral travelers would be able to intercept the signal or would just be bothered greatly by it. They could even block those signals in the astral plane if they knew it was there. The fact that Xavier has not said anything and many of the students had cell phones meant the concealing part had worked fine. Other pieces in the package were an altered ruby that could channel strength energy, an altered sapphire that could channel ice energy, an altered tourmaline for fire, heat, and light energy, an altered emerald for illusion energy, an altered opal for cloud and mist energy, and an altered diamond for dimension energy. Of course, Harry didn't show it off as sorcery, even though that was basically what most of them were. He used scientific jargon and called the effect phenomenon, and showed charts and graphs and numbers explaining how each energy field interacted with the world. Of course, not calling it magic didn't stop people from recognizing how unbelievable it all was. No one in the lecture hall would argue that if all the properties shown by those materials were possible, the world would change. A number of groups did not apply for the packages either because they couldn't afford the penalty fees from losing them, or because they were smart enough to realize the possibility of them being stolen and their security wasn't enough. Harry somewhat rushed through the rest of the meetings, and once the day was over he headed over to Kamar Taj to give the Ancient One an update. After tea, the Ancient One summarized, "Overall, I cannot say you could have done better. Using a self-generated time travel loop is disturbing and there may be consequences in the future, but having tricked her into the mirror dimension and dealing so much damage to her to the point of possibly killing her physical form is a worthwhile feat." Harry had not left out anything about the conversation they had and the fight that followed, including the spells he used and how she responded. He knew that some part of him may have wanted to be praised a little for getting one over on Celine the Immortal, and he did smile at her assessment. Harry did not consider himself a hero, but he was of the mind to keep the collateral damage caused by him to a minimum when he could. The Ancient One continued, Selene is not the only person of power you have drawn the attention of. Does the name Jean Khan, of Khan Industries ring a bell? Harry nodded, CEO of one of the largest, most advanced, nastiest tech companies of Asia. The Ancient One continued, Jean Khan is the given name of the Mandarin. Harry froze for a moment and sighed. He did in fact give his name to that guy and showed his face. Although they were literally on the other side of the planet from each other, that didn't mean there would not be any interactions. However, he accepted that he would have come to head with such a person eventually, so it didn't matter. The Ancient One then pulled out the cell phone Harry had gifted her, and after a moment handed it to Harry. The phone was on the Mystic Knowledge website the temple hosted and seemed to be a post on the forum with some pictures of old texts. The Ancient One asked, Do you recognize this? Harry recognized the script of course, and the content was more than a little disconcerting. Harry answered, pages from the Book of Erebus. Scripts about the blood god La Magra. Where did this come from? Ping. New quest, stop the rise of the blood god. Vampires are plotting the resurrection of La Magra, stop the ritual or defeat La Magra. The Ancient One didn't see Harry get the quest and said, it was posted by someone in New York. I believe his name is Whistler. Harry read over the post a few times. Whistler had posted a picture of some ancient parchment which appeared to be from the Book of Erebus, the Vampire Bible. He was asking for expert on the matter to assist with the translations, and it had only been posted a few hours ago. Harry told the Ancient One he got a quest, so she asked, would you like any backup? Harry considered it but answered, no. La Magra can turn humans into vampires with its mere presence if some of the things I've read are true. I don't have actual blood so I should be safe, but I can't guarantee anyone but you would not be affected. And her needing to stay at Kamartaj was left unsaid. The Ancient One's body was not exactly alive due to the presence of energy from the dark dimension. If removed from her body, her blood would rapidly age to dust and a blood transfusion into her would do more harm than good, which was why she had to be careful in combat. The Ancient One then said, then I expect you to call me if you cannot handle it on your own. Harry agreed of course, and after using some means to track down the IP address, he used a portal to take himself back to New York. What he found however was just a routing box someone hacked into, so Harry had to take out some hacking tools of his own to track the physical location of the IP address. 5 minutes later he found it. The system was rather old, which, oddly enough, was a great anti-hacking measure as old stuff takes longer to hack than new stuff. Harry tracked the IP address to a warehouse and concealed himself. The warehouse smelled of metal, gunpowder, and blood. Fresh blood. He teleported in and found it seemingly silent of life. There were fresh corpses strewn about from what looked like an assault squad that had raided the place no more than an hour ago. The fact that their bodies were not recovered was a clear indication of the alignment of the corpses. In the center was a workstation with a chair. There seemed to be a man sitting on the chair, covered in blood. To the side of him was a gun. Harry used several spells on the man and found a number of things. First and unsurprisingly, there was a bullet hole in his chest. It entered one side and went out the other. The next thing he found was that even before the bullet, the man was severely lacking in blood. He was covered in bite marks and claw marks, and his face looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to it, repeatedly. The last, and probably most interesting thing he found, was that the man was not dead. Not completely anyways. This man appeared to be Whistler and Harry's only lead on the blood god. He was obviously attacked by vampires and left barely alive. He then shot himself, probably with a silver bullet, but the bullet went through the other side and he had yet to completely turn. There were two types of vampires to Harry, magic vampires and non-magic vampires. Magic vampires were vampire witches and wizards and stronger in some senses and weaker in others compared to Muggle vampires. Magic vampires were not mortally affected by sunlight and could survive minor exposure without harm, though long-term exposure would make them extremely sick and kill them eventually. They were not harmed by garlic or silver, though they did have a strong aversion to it. Magic vampires also had better control over themselves and required blood less frequently, which was why, though considered dark creatures, it was illegal to hunt magic vampires. Since they did not instantly burst into flame upon contact with sunlight, they were not considered threats to the Statue of Secrecy. Magic vampires also had to follow interesting rules, such as they could not enter a house uninvited. They were also incapable of turning someone else into a vampire in the presence of a heavy garlic smell and had issues crossing running water or setting sail from the sea during the changing of tides. However, a magic vampire could only turn a witch or wizard into a magic vampire. Their bite had no effect on muggles. They were also only marginally stronger and faster than a normal magical and could not have children. Most magic vampires hunted only muggles and used memory charms to hide their activities. Since they weren't a great danger to witches and wizards, only muggles who they usually didn't kill, they were not considered a great threat to the magical communities. Magical vampires also aged at about the same rate as witches and wizards, so they were not immortal and not considered all that different from uninfected witches and wizards. Non-magical vampires were different. They had many weaknesses, but were physically much stronger and faster. They did not have to follow any rules either, so breaking into a home and killing everyone wasn't difficult for them. They stopped aging once infected and could sexually reproduce. Their children aged to adulthood before they too stopped aging and were considered pure bloods. Either type, turned or pure blood could spread their vampirism to any muggle who survived their bite. Should a muggle vampire bite a witch or wizard, said magical would lose their magic and turn into a muggle vampire. Solely because of this, the magic community had one policy on muggle vampires: exterminate on sight. This policy, when compared to magic vampires, really showed that magic communities only really cared about their magic. Harry took a vial of elixir of life from his inventory and poured it down the man's throat. The elixir didn't technically heal people. It used life to remove death. This meant it was also a handy cure to most things. It shouldn't heal muggle vampirism, but the man was still, just barely on this side of human, and his wounds had not started healing yet. Harry smiled once he sensed the man's life return. The vampirism was eradicated and the man's wounds were closing up. Some of his wrinkles smoothed and an old injury in the man's leg also appeared to be healing. Once the man was no longer mostly dead, Harry pressed a finger to the man's forehead and read his memories. Once finished, Harry paused and looked over what he had just read. Overall, he was impressed. Technically, Whistler was a murderer and could be considered prejudice against another race. Harry wasn't going to hold that against him though. Harry didn't consider himself a saint either. What was most interesting was this Blade character. From what Harry could tell, Blade was a muggleborn whose mother was bitten by a vampire. Because of that, somehow, Blade was a hybrid. Part muggle vampire, part magic vampire. Harry didn't know if he could cast magic, but he had no doubt his blood was special. He had complete immunity to sunlight and no aversion to garlic or silver, which even magic vampires couldn't say. According to what Harry read on the situation, some muggle vampire named Deacon Frost was going to resurrect the blood god. Such a ritual would not work without magical blood, which was why they needed Blade. Deacon and his minions found the warehouse and kicked Whistler's ass and took a woman named Karen. Karen had, surprisingly, figured out how to cure non-pure blood vampires. She had been bitten and had cured herself. Blade knew it was a trap, but still went after her. Harry ran over to a DVD player in the shop that already had in it a DVD that Frost had left for Blade to watch. The video showed the address of a penthouse Harry didn't recognize. Instead of pulling up a map of New York, Harry went over to the workstation Karen had set up and found some of her blood. Harry used a tracking spell to lock in on her location and made a portal. On the other side was Karen, lying on a couch with a handkerchief on her neck. She looked quite shocked at the portal and Harry just asked, "Where's Blade?" She apparently got over her shock quite quickly and said, "Downstairs killing vampires." Harry shrugged and pointed to the portal behind him. "That's Whistler's warehouse. Get out now and I'll help Blade." Harry didn't have time to argue, so he put a light compulsion spell on the woman to get her to leave. Harry read her surface memories as she walked past him and saw that they already got Blade's blood and she had given him lots of her own to get him back on his feet. Harry also cast a discreet diagnosis spell on her and confirmed she had muggle vampirism. Did that mean that Blade could only transmit muggle vampirism, or could he turn a wizard into a magical vampire? Harry supposed it didn't matter, no one would ever volunteer to test that. Harry ran down the stairs and saw the bodies of dead humans and the ash piles of slain vampires. Harry didn't care about the humans as they were certainly vampire servants. Such people considered themselves future vampires and stopped considering themselves humans, meaning they could look down on and treat humans as disposable. If they didn't consider themselves humans, Harry had even less reason to care about their deaths. Harry cast a few stealth spells that rendered him invisible and hid his smell. The building was a penthouse from the outside, but the inside had been heavily renovated with cut stone into an exact replica of a ritual chamber. Harry admitted whoever built this thing wasn't an amateur, and if he wasn't dead by dawn, he'd need to find him. Harry peered over a ledge and saw the center of the ritual formation, which had a pale vampire saturated in high-level necromantic energies, watching a black vampire with an interesting magical signature dust his way through groups of other vampires. One look at the pasty vampire told Harry this was not going to be simple. He immediately conjured a mandala of dimensional energy and started casting a heavy barrier spell over the site. One bonus from a working ritual room was that it was compatible with lots of other spells. This one would prevent anyone from leaving until Harry dispelled the barrier or was killed. Blade finished off the last vampires, and Frost took up a sword. Blade charged forward to meet him blade to blade as Harry watched from above while continuing to cast his barrier spell. The sound of metal echoed through the ritual stone chamber was each rapid clash of their weapons. They moved faster than the human eye could follow, and Blade was on the losing end of speed but was gaining ground through skill. A feint that turned into a parry removed Frost's arm, but in the next moment it grew back. Frost's speed suddenly magnified and Harry cringed. At the moment, Frost was still in control, but the more time went on and the more of the blood god's power he used, the less Frost there would be. Harry put in a bit more magic into speeding up the barrier spell, he'd be needed soon. After being knocked down, Blade threw his sword into the crack of a stone wall that had some vials Harry recognized lodged within. The sword handle snapped open using a clever mechanism, and the rock holding the vials cracked and allowed Blade to catch them as they fell. Frost didn't seem worried about the vials and referred to them as Blade Serum. Harry knew what they were from the info he got from Whistler and knew what was going to happen. Blade threw vial after vial at Frost of the anticoagulant compound, and after a moment the human form of the blood god had swollen to massive proportions. Harry heard Blade calmly state, "Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill," before he did a flying roundhouse kick to shoot the last vial straight into the bloated god's forehead. The swollen mass grew larger and redder until with a painful groan of Frost it burst open and showered the room in a mass of blood. Harry sighed and shouted down to the vampire hunter, "Hey! You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Blade looked up to the unfamiliar 15-year-old wizard pointing at the bloodstains on the wall. Harry was thankful he completed his barrier spell. The real fight was about to start. The puddles of blood had Blade's attention and he watched as they started wriggling. Harry heard the hunter utter a curse as the blood shot up into the air and formed a wriggling ball of blood. Harry jumped down from the ledge several stories and landed with a crouched fist to the ground and a crack of stone beneath his feet. He figured the hunter might give him some respect if he made an entrance. Harry was wearing a basilisk hooded cloak to make himself look a bit more professional. The t-shirt and jeans he changed into after the dissertation would not leave a reliable impression. Blade apparently wasn't the type for small talk, so he motioned to the massive rippling ball of blood floating in the center of the ritual chamber and asked, "And you have a better idea?" Harry conjured some golden eternal fire and said, "I might." He enlarged the inextinguishable fire, and from within dozens of small birds and large birds, composed of yellow flames, flew out and into the blood mass. Harry expected the eternal fire to incinerate the blood, but the firebirds that flew into the blood ball were engulfed and went out. Blade looked over to him and raised an eyebrow. Harry awkwardly admitted that wasn't supposed to happen. Streams of blood poured in from various corners and floors of the building. Harry recognized their paths as those from the human corpses he had walked by. Harry said, "You certainly killed a lot of familiars." Blade answered smoothly, "It's what I do." Harry rose a hand into the air and started building up a charge of lightning. His hand started to glow and crackle with electricity, and in the next moment Harry fired an enormous bolt of lightning into the blood ball, which pierced through to the other side. And did nothing. Blade looked unimpressed and added, "Can you do ice?" Harry sighed and called forth icy energy from Icthalon's realm. He conjured a dozen ice spears of various sizes and shot them into the blood ball. And nothing happened. The ball had finished collecting all the blood in the building and was now squirming and molding itself into a solid shape. Harry pulled out potions, poisons, and acids from his inventory and threw them at the blood mass with no effect. Harry tried transfiguring the blood into something else and tried alchemy, but neither had an effect. He tried pulling it into an expanded bag with telekinesis, but it had no effect. Harry was getting pissed and shouted, "Do you think this is Dungeons and Dragons? Are you a god or an ooze? What other species is immune to fire, ice, lightning, poison, acid, and psionics you knock off?" That earned Harry a slightly amused stare from Blade. Harry concentrated his anger and summoned Phoenix Fire. This took too long to create for a fight and was too slow to shoot, but the god had yet to finish his transformation and was still just floating there. Harry created the largest batch of Phoenix Flame he could and launched it at the blood god. The blood seared and a shriek of pain could be heard. The blood successfully caught on fire, but only the surface. All parts of the blood that were ignited were thrown off the blood god, which decided to stop taking its time and quickly finished its transformation into a giant creature seemingly composed of bundles of thick, crimson vines Harry knew to be densely packed volumes of blood. It looked like a giant bundle of veins of various sizes, given a bipedal form. Blade readied his sword, and at the moment the creature formed, he sliced at the creature's side. The sword passed through without difficulty, but the wound closed up in the next moment. The creature opened its eyes and shouted in a razor-edged voice, "Blade." Harry figured this meant Frost was still in there. The blood god avatar moved far faster than would be expected from its size, and the grotesque appendage it used as an arm stretched and quickly wrapped around Blade's torso and began to crush him. Harry cast a slippery spell on Blade which made the surface of his body frictionless, though Harry left his hands and feet unaffected. This allowed Blade to use his strength to slip free as Harry tried to distract the blood god by shooting the avatar's eye with some bullets from his magic gun. Blade got some distance and Harry shouted, "I've been wailing at him for 3 minutes and the first thing he does is attack you? Where is the love?" The blood god finally noticed Harry and said with a blood-curdling voice, "Human? You serve me now." He emitted a red aura which engulfed the ritual room and spread out to engulf the whole building. Harry felt it stop at his barriers though. Ping. Status effect, instant vampirism negated due to Obscurus body. Harry threw a silver ring behind the blood god which expanded into a massive portal into black space. Harry then pulled out his railgun gourd and pulled the trigger. The blood god exploded and the bullet traveled through the silver portal behind the blood god into the vacuum of space Harry set as the destination. The nature of the portal prevented air from getting sucked through it into the vacuum, so Harry used his telekinesis to push the scattered drops of the blood god through the portal. However, the moment the first drop reached the surface of the portal where it should have been sucked into the vacuum, Harry felt the portal shatter. He suddenly felt like he had been electrocuted from the backlash. It was common sense that powerful magical beings could not be forced through portals, but he hoped the blood god was an exception. Turns out nope. He can trick powerful beings into walking through a portal themselves, but he couldn't push them through. The blood drops converged and almost instantly the avatar reformed and was looking rather pissed at Harry. Blade used the moment where the god's attention was not on him to cut several times through its legs to disable it for a moment. Blade asked Harry, "That fire which hurt the fucker. Can you make it again?" Harry knew he was referring to the Phoenix Flame. The backlash from the collapsed portal would make it difficult to cast magic for a moment, but psionics were not an issue, it just took a while. Harry said, "Yes, but it will take a few seconds." He's not going to just stand there and take it though. Blade asked, "Can you use it on my sword?" Harry smirked, "Now there's an idea. Keep him distracted." Blade ran over to continue pissing the god off and impressively dodged the monster's high-speed attacks. Harry opened his inventory and got out a goblin silver sword of his own design and started coalescing Phoenix Flame into his hand. He didn't know if this would work, but he figured this blade would last longer than the silver-coated sword Blade was using. Goblin silver was far stronger than normal silver after all. The blood god realized Blade was a distraction and that Harry was up to something, so it pointed all its appendages at Harry and they shot forward like spears. Harry wondered why the monster hadn't been doing so all along and apparat to the other side of the room and continued gathering flames. His barrier prevented others from escaping, but he could still make portals and teleport as he pleased. Once Harry had enough fire, he placed it onto the goblin silver edge and threw the sword to Blade, who jumped into the air and caught it with ease. The sword had natural enchantments on it to raise the user's speed and Blade turned into a blur. The glowing flames of the sword created a path of light as Blade zigzagged around the blood god and slashed into its form over and over from every angle. Within 3 seconds from grabbing the sword, Blade had cut the blood god 20 times, leaving trails of burning blood over every inch of its body. The blood god tried in vain to separate itself from the flames, but more and more flames continued to be added with each slash. Finally realizing this was not going to end well, the blood god did what all powerful evil villains do when it looks like they were going to lose. It ran. The Phoenix Flame couldn't permanently kill the actual blood god who had simply been resurrected into this avatar, but it would certainly do real damage to it, and the lingering remnant of frost which insisted on killing Blade was smothered from the blood god's instincts, forcing him to give up the fight. The blood god's form elongated and stretched into that of a spear coated in phoenix flames and quickly charged into the wall to pierce through. Only to smash straight into the barrier. Harry couldn't help but smirk. This was the difference between power acquired quickly and power acquired properly. Frost was instinctively using the properties of the blood god pretty well for defense, but didn't know the first thing about using godly energies to attack. He was ignorant of magic, and since the barrier was tied into the stone of the very ritual room used to create the blood god, it was very effective against it. This was not exactly a coincidence. Harry doubted it was written down in whatever Frost used to make this room, but most ritual summoning chambers doubled as containment chambers. This ritual room really was well done and could be used for both. Blade caught up to the blood spear still smashing into the barrier in a panic, and Blade launched himself forward, cutting the entire spear-shaped mass lengthwise in half. He then noticed the sword's hilt had caught fire and threw it before Blade himself was taken by the flame. Harry created several psionic barriers around the dying avatar and performed a few detection spells to make sure none was missed. It was a shame they killed it with Phoenix Flame, as that meant there would be no experience points since Phoenix Flames burned everything into pure life force, but he would at least have something to collect. Blade asked, "Why didn't you turn?" Blade knew that La Magra could turn humans into vampire minions instantly, and Harry smelled human. Harry answered easily, "I'm made of stronger stuff. Speaking of turning, I found Karen upstairs when I got here and used a portal to send her to Whistler's warehouse. So she wasn't here when La Magra here used his aura." "And what are you?" Harry smiled, "A rich guy with a hobby." The final embers of Phoenix Fire burnt the last bits of the blood god, and Harry heard the sound he was waiting for. Ping. Quest completed, stop the rise of the blood god. Reward, +2 magic path rank. Harry smiled at the reward. His magic path rank jumping from 42 to 44 was a very large increase in skill for him. It was getting really hard to increase path ranks after 40. Though in retrospect the difficulty of the quest deserved that reward. Frost was like a noob using a level 99 character for the first time, but the longer he fought the stronger he would get. If it were for the non-standard effect of Phoenix Flame combined with Blade's excellent sword skill and quick thinking, that battle would not have been so cut and dry. He probably would have hidden in a corner and called the Ancient One for backup. Harry dispelled the barrier and collected the life force. Blade noticed the glowing glyphs on the wall which shined when La Magra smashed into it fade away. Harry said, "I want to check on Karen to make sure she is alright." With that, Harry made another silver portal into Whistler's warehouse and walked in. Blade followed once he confirmed the scent of the place. Harry felt Blade and Wolverine would get along very well. Harry could tell Blade wanted answers, so Harry said, "I'll answer your questions after everyone is here." Karen shouted from another room in the warehouse, "Over here." Blade led on and Harry followed. Karen was at the same workstation Harry got her blood from and seemed to be using whatever she had developed to cure her infection once more. Harry definitely wanted to speak with her about that. Blade. What the fuck happened? For the first time since Harry met him, Blade showed some actual surprise when Whistler walked over. He had changed his bloody shirt and gotten himself cleaned up. He was no longer limping and even seemed a few years younger. Yet Blade could tell he wasn't a vampire and that Whistler himself had no idea what was going on. Harry said, "That was me. Sit down and I'll tell you what happened." Neither Whistler nor Blade sat, which wasn't a surprise. Harry continued anyway. Whistler posted some pages on the Book of Erebus to mysticknowledge.com for assistance with the translation. That site is actually serviced by something of an order of mystic monks who defend the world from mystic threats. I'm something of a freelancer who works with them. I was asked to confirm the translation as well and determine the threat. I tracked Whistler's IP address here and found him mostly dead. I used some rather valuable mystic elixir to heal him, though not because I'm an upstanding guy. Harry turned to Whistler and said, "No offense, but you were my only lead, so saving you was my only option." Harry continued, "After returning him from the brink his mind was healed enough for me to read." "Yes, I can do that. I learned what Frost had planned but had no idea where you were, so I used tracking magic on Karen's blood which she left around." "Yes, I can do that too. Once I found her, I made a portal, sent her back, helped Blade kill a god, and now we're back." "Any questions?" Whistler asked quickly, "What else did you learn from my head?" Harry answered, "Enough. You guys do good work." Harry turned to Karen and asked, "Now Ms. Jensen, would you mind showing me how your cure works? I'd prefer if some more testing was done, but if there are no lasting negative effects I'd like to sponsor your research and perhaps mass production." Karen looked taken aback and asked, "How much?" 50,000 for startup and another 5,000 a month until you finish or give a reason to need more. Karen asked, "Will you need an invoice?" She was asking in a roundabout way if the money could be spent on things other than her research. Harry said, "I can pay you in cash off the books if that's what you want. If some of the funds gets donated." Harry looked at Whistler and Blade before continuing, to a cause you support that's fine with me as long as there are some results within 6 months. Karen smirked and asked, where do I sign? Much less results, she had a finished and tested product and had no problem making money reconfirming her results. Harry explained some of the details of his ideas and said he'd have some papers over the next day. He also asked if she wanted some extra security for her lab and Harry said he'd be willing to pay out of his own pocket for that. Whistler caught on that they were basically coming up with legal ways to pay and upgrade Whistler's and Blade's operation and both had a few words of input and suggestions on security equipment and guards. Harry also said he'd introduce Blade to a master smith who would enjoy forging weapons for someone who put them to good use. Up until now he had alluding to mystic monks, but hadn't told them about the magic world. Blade was either an untrained muggleborn or a variant squib, so introducing him to the goblins was not against the law as long as he didn't tell Whistler or Karen what he saw and learned. When everything was settled, Harry called the Ancient One and gave her an update. She asked what Harry would do with a mass-produced cure and Harry would just sell it on mysticknowledge.com as exactly what it was. If the cure acted fast enough, he could even put it in a gun and combine it with a potent tranquilizer to knock out vampires which would then wake up cured. Harry wouldn't do so to be nice to them, of course. It was closer to a sinister prank than an act of kindness. He doubted a cured vampire would praise the loss of their superhuman abilities even if it meant not thirsting for human blood and being able to see the sun. Someone who was used to such a thing having suddenly lost it would feel weak and powerless. Of course, they might be able to find someone to turn them back. He'd have Karen look into ways to stop people from being turned or ways to poison a person's blood against vampires to set a trap for those who tried turning the cured. Harry wondered if he was turning sadistic and decided to consult his girlfriends about it. Though some of them were worse than he was. Harry spent the next 6 weeks signing papers, negotiating deals, and dealing with property. One of the companies partially owned by PNG Bank and Trust purchased a property Harry chose in New York and had it demolished. It was currently being rebuilt under Harry's exact specifications and would be finished by the second week of August. Harry's metagems were due to return in 2 weeks and Harry was eagerly waiting to see what shenanigans they tried. He wondered out of 10 how many groups would return all the samples and how many would have them stolen, lost, or try to return fakes to him and claim they were real. One night, however, Harry received a text message from the compact mirror phone he gave to Emma Frost. The message actually had Harry do a double take and in the next moment he filled his backpack with gemstones and teleported to Xavier's study. The message read, I've been kidnapped by giant, mutant hunting robots. Can't talk, please send help. If you want to support me, check out my Patreon at https://www.patreon.com/Kayashin. I tend to polls that decide important plot stuff in my P at Trian. Many thanks to my awesome patrons. Ben Phillips.
If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.